So we're very pleased and honored to have with us today somebody who is very well known here at APARC and on the Stanford campus and probably at almost every university around the world by now and globally. My friend and colleague Gita Wirjawan. This is to mark the occasion of what I think it's fair to say is one of the most important books written about Southeast Asia in recent decades. That I think provides us with a perspective on the path forward if the potential of Southeast Asia and countries like Indonesia is going to be fulfilled in this time of global change. And no one better qualified to speak about those issues than Pakita, whose podcast has already reached over 100 million people. And how many subscribers now? 1.09 million subscribers. So there is no better spokesperson for Southeast Asia that I can think of. And Gita, we're so pleased to have you here today at APARC to talk to us about your new book and about the way forward. So with that, perhaps a few remarks from you.
Thank you so much, Dave. I want to thank APARC and the Precourt Institute for helping host this event under the leadership of Kyo and also with the support from the Consulate General of Indonesia. I'm so delighted that institutions take ownership with what I think is so dear and important, at least to me, hopefully to some of you. This is a region that spans over about 5,000 kilometers longitudinally from the little town called Tanwe in the westernmost part of Myanmar or Southeast Asia to Merauke, the easternmost town of Papua or Southeast Asia. And latitudinally, it's 4,000 kilometers from the northernmost part of Myanmar, a little town called Nokmung, to Boa, a little town in Nusa Tenggara, which is the eastern part of Indonesia. 4,000 kilometers is equivalent to the distance between Tehran and London. 5,000 kilometers is equivalent to the distance between Boston and San Francisco. But oftentimes the immensity and the diversity as it relates to the 700 million people, ethnically, racially, religiously, it gets obfuscated with our inability to tell stories to ourselves, much less to the rest of the world. And empirically, if you take a look at the publications in Southeast Asia, it amounts to about 375,000 books about Southeast Asia, many of which are written by non-Southeast Asians, in a context of about 140 million books all throughout the world. So that represents about 0.276% of all publications available. For a region with a population of 700 million people, that represents about 9% of the world population. So I think the responsibility for Southeast Asians is to learn how to tell stories better. And hopefully storytelling that is rich in terms of not just literacy, but numeracy. Now, I'm in a camp that believes that we're sort of like in a somewhat geopolitical watershed as it relates to China and the US. I'm still a believer of the possibility or the fact that the relations between the US and China will be mostly technological, economic, and geopolitical. I'm not there yet to assume that it'll be kinetic. Now, to the extent that that premise be shared and believed, then I think it will entail inevitably some sort of an equilibrium for Southeast Asia. Unlike what perhaps what we might have suffered from in the 17th century when the Manchus decided to domesticate themselves within the Ming Dynasty as they transitioned from the pre-existing Ming Dynasty. And that created a bit of a vacuum with respect to the incoming European forces, as a result of which we went through about 3.5 centuries of humiliation in Southeast Asia, for the most part. Now, to the extent that this equilibrium that I sort of believe in will prevail, then I think the onus is really upon us in Southeast Asia, upon us Southeast Asians, to actually improve upon our pre-existing cognitive capacities so that we can also better distribute cognitive capacity, so that we can move up the value chain, so that we can move up the global geopolitical order, so that we can move from the periphery to the core of global consciousness. That's, in essence, what the book is trying to tell you. It tells you the story about Southeast Asia from different lenses, from its colonial history, religious history, economics, education, sustainability, AI, internet, geopolitics, and it tries to be somewhat prescriptive in a rather oversimplistic manner about what Southeast Asians or Southeast Asia would need to do going forward if we were to believe in this geopolitical watershed. Educationally, unfortunately, we're so divergent, despite the diversity ethnically, religiously, and culturally. The PISA scores are very telling. That's a measurement of the lingual and STEM proficiencies of the 15-year-olds in Southeast Asia. Only 2 countries surpass the global average, Singapore and Vietnam. Singapore being number 1 in the world now. They've toppled China. Vietnam, we all know what Vietnam went through until the mid-70s, but they have come around in a big way. These are, I think, inspirational stories to the 15-year-olds elsewhere in Southeast Asia. Now, at the tertiary level, Southeast Asia has 8,000 universities with 19 million students, compared to China, with only 2,600 universities, 39 million students. But China has not only placed 2 of its universities in the top 20, but have doggedly projected to the world their ability to produce goods and services which are consumable by humanity in a big way. That, I think, is a projection of the kind of intellectual power that China has been able to not only embrace, but also project to the rest of the world. Now, can Southeast Asia do a bit of that? I think we have to actually look at ourselves introspectively. In the last 30 years, economically, the GDP per capita of China has grown by a factor of 10 times, whereas that of Southeast Asia only a factor of 2.7 times. This is highly identifiably because of 5 stark attributes. The first one of which is the underinvestment of education, except for Singapore, of course. The second is the underinvestment of infrastructure, again, except for Singapore. The third, the lack of optimal intersection between power and talent. Call that governance. And the fourth is competitiveness. I've often shared that China has been able to issue 10 business licenses on a per 1,000 adult people basis, whereas Southeast Asia on average has been able to issue 1 business license on a per 1,000 adult people basis. At varying degrees in Southeast Asia, Singapore has been able to issue more than 9 business licenses on a per 1,000 adult people basis, whereas Indonesia and the Philippines can only issue 0.3 business licenses on a per 1,000 adult people basis. And the fifth, which is a bit paradoxical, China politically is centralized, but economically is much more decentralized, whereas most countries in Southeast Asia are democratic, politically decentralized, but economically much more centralized. And this is empirical. If you take a look at the centripetalism, which depicts how the primary cities in most parts of Southeast Asia enjoy a faster, higher growth than the secondary cities, much less the little towns and villages. So I think if we can identify and agree on what's identified as being the structural reasons for the underperformance, the elites in Southeast Asia, and hopefully those that are likely to be elites in the near foreseeable future, they can start taking a view. But I think the long view has to be with what's structural. And that, I think, is human capital at the most non-tertiary level all the way to the tertiary level. Now, last, I just want to mention, I think the money is there, the technology is there. It may sound counterintuitive. I think the technology will increasingly come from China. Despite the enormity of the economic relations between Southeast Asia and China, last year manifested in about $1 trillion worth of collective trade in goods and services, whereas that with the US would have been about 530 billion. But increasingly, we will have to look at China more technological capital allocation purposes. Why? Because they're much cheaper. Most Southeast Asians, their GDP per capita are well below $10,000. Indonesia at $5,000, Malaysia at $12,500, Singapore at $91,000, but the Laotians, Cambodians, Myanmarese, they're at below $2,000. They can't afford an iPhone. They can only afford an Oppo. An Oppo is much cheaper than an iPhone, and it takes better pictures too. For some of you that didn't know. So I think that's the inclination, naturally, for the next 10 years. I'm not here to say what's going to happen beyond 10 years, but we will have to inevitably look at the US more for economic capital allocation purposes. Why? Because of the tremendous liquidity that's in the US on the back of this massive quantitative easing that's taken place in the last few decades. The reason why liquidity is not being diversified out of the US to Southeast Asia, again, with the exception of Singapore, is because of two structural impediments. The first is the lack of rule of law. We need to enforce what needs to be enforced. Unfortunately, most countries in Southeast Asia are still not very good at that yet. The second is the lack of wherewithal to translate from uncertainties to risk. Uncertainties are unknown unknowns, risks are known unknowns. Stuff that you can quantify, predict, measure, and price. Anything that can be priced is oxygen for capital allocation purposes, but that's not happening. And you can clearly see in Southeast Asia, which has been getting about $200 to $230 billion worth of FDI, of which Singapore gets about 100 to 140 billion. Indonesia gets only 30 billion. Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand each gets about 10 to 20 billion. In a good year, sometimes more than 20 billion, but they don't have those two attributes the way Singapore embraces rule of law and translational wherewithal. Now, can we get there? I'm optimistic we can get there, particularly with respect to the second, the latter. That, I think, will require much more robust investment in STEM. Southeast Asia only produces about 750,000 STEM products. India, 2.5 million. China, 4.5 million per year. So the denominator, I think, needs to go to at least 2 million per year for Southeast Asia. It wants to be competitive. To the extent we don't increase that number of STEM products production from 750 to much larger, I think we're going to be exposed. The last bit is really with respect to energy. I think energy is an underrated unequalizer. It's not just income, it's not just wealth, it's not just opportunity. Most countries in Southeast Asia are not electrified at more than 5,000 kilowatt hour per capita. The US is at 10,000, China is at 10,000, Singapore and Brunei are at 10,000, Malaysia at 5,000, Indonesia at 1,300 kilowatt hour per capita. Most others are well below 2,000 kilowatt hour per capita. In the era of AI, we need to be at least at 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita. So the question is, in order for the 8 countries out of the 10 countries in Southeast Asia to get to 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita, which is really first base camp for modernity, we're going to have to build a terawatt, which is 1 million megawatts, which will cost about $2 to $3 trillion using renewables. That's an economic impossibility at the rate that we're attracting very little FDI. So the way out of this is really to improve upon our pre-existing rule of law, to really invest disproportionately more in STEM so that we can translate better from uncertainties to risks, so that we can attain modernity. Then I think we can move, hopefully less than slowly, from the periphery to the core of global consciousness.
Thank you very much for sharing your vision with us. I think it's appropriate that one of the last topics you touched on was energy, since you are now based at the Precourt Institute for Energy here at Stanford, whose director, Will Chu, joined us today as a co-sponsor of this event along with APARC. And so I'd like to ask you a more personal question that relates to that. So you have now sort of reconfigured your existence a bit into spending a significant amount of time every year here at Stanford, several months a year, for which I and I think all of us are deeply grateful, because you've been an incredible catalyst for helping us to develop Southeast Asia work here at Stanford, in APARC, and in the Door School, and in Precourt. So if you don't mind me asking, why have you done that? And what do you see as the role of us here in Stanford and American universities more broadly in this effort to tell a better story about Southeast Asia, to produce the kinds of changes that you have talked about today, and of course go into much more detail about in your book?
Well, first of all, I love Stanford. Second of all, I love the weather. For somebody who likes to be outdoors, this is much better than the East Coast. Much better than in Jakarta most days, because it's so hot out there. Third, I think if there's got to be an institution that can help elevate the relevance of Southeast Asia, it's got to be a great institution on the Pacific, given the fact that Southeast Asia is on the Pacific. And I don't think I've done wrong in that. And Stanford has been so gracious, so generous to me in providing the necessary intellectualization by way of my meeting up and discussing anything with people like you, David, Will, Keo, and all the rest at APARC and the Door School. This has helped me crystallize my thinking about the region that I think is so under-narrated. And if there's anybody that can help Sherpa the narrating of Southeast Asia to the next level, I can't find anything better than Stanford. And the fact that Stanford, I think, is somewhat taken ownership with the importance of this region is gratifying to me personally, but hopefully institutionally for most parts of Southeast Asia.
That message of narration ultimately will have to be carried forward by the students that we engage with here in Stanford. And you and I recognize some of the amazing students sitting around this table that are here today. What's your message to them about what they can do, what they should do, because we know that many of them share this vision that you have?
Well, I look at you and I look at them as community multipliers. I think storytelling requires community multiplication. And these are ambassadors of goodwill that are going to go back to their respective countries, not necessarily just in Southeast Asia, but even beyond that, will basically speak and talk about, the importance of this region with $4 trillion worth of goods and services, which represents about the sixth largest economy in the world after the US, China, Germany, the EU, Germany, and Japan. The third largest population after India and China, but not being told the way it should be. And I'm sort of like encouraged by the fact that the representation of Southeast Asians on campus has increased, in the last 2 to 3 years. And that, I think, has to do with the fact that you and I have tried very forcefully to tell the story about Southeast Asia to more people than necessary on campus and beyond. And hopefully that will take us to a much higher level in terms of representation on the back of this community multiplication.
At this point, I'm sure that there are many who would have questions for Gita or like to engage. So let's take those. The first is back here on the left. Yes, sir.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Mr. Wirjawan, for sharing the lot of insights. We know you were the former Minister of the Trade, and also you're also head of the Investment Association back in the days. If you look at in the next decade, what's going to lift the GDP globally, probably nobody is going to dispute, say AI is going to be a major fact. And if we talk about the global landscape of AI, for sure it's concentrated right now in major corporations and a handful of countries, especially US and China. And if we look at the Southeast Asia, what's your view or vision? What's going to that look like in about 5 to 10 years in Southeast Asia regarding the AI space? Thank you.
When you use ChatGPT, Grok, Gemini, or even DeepSeek, it uses 10 to 50 times more energy than a simple search in Google. I happen to also be in the film industry. We use a platform called Sora. It uses 10,000 times more energy than a simple search on Google. So I know right there the structural limitation is lack of energy at the rate that we're not building fast enough. Indonesia builds about 3,000 megawatts per year. In order to go up from 1,300 kilowatt hour to 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita, which is still way below 10,000, which is where the US and China are, Indonesia will need 121 years. So the way out of this is to increase the denominator from 3,000 per year to hopefully at least 20,000 per year. The technology is there, but the money's not there. I think decision-making can be improved at the government level so that it's more investment climate friendly. But I talked about the rule of law, the lack of translational wherewithal. So I'm still not very optimistic about AI in the context of Southeast Asia. I think at best, we're just going to be an enabler. At worst, we're going to be some sort of a consumer. And I think at the philosophical level, I'm somewhat encouraged by the insistence of some platforms to be open source as opposed to closed source and for profit. I speak for not only most parts of Southeast Asia, but I speak for the Global South. The Global South represents about 84% of humanity. They earn less than $13,000. We call that developing economies. I think they're only going to be able to move up the cognitive capacity chain on the back of further democratization, further open sourcing, philosophically speaking, of any kind of AI platforms. So you kind of alluded to the possibility that I think AI is going to be within the hands of a few. I think just those in China and those in the US. I think that will, dovetail into some, not only technological bifurcation, but I think some inflationary consequence. To the extent that it becomes inflationary on the back of technological bifurcation, then the poorer countries in Southeast Asia will have to choose which technological provision will be cheaper than the other, right? And I still say, I think Chinese technology so far, despite its inability to do 0 to 1, as much as the United States' ability to do 0 to 1, I think they will continue to be able to procure technology much more cheaply. And that will resonate to not only the developing countries in Southeast Asia, but I think developing countries throughout the global South. That would be my view on AI.
So I second that you're saying in the Southeast Asian market, people there might be consumers of AI. That's very concerning, like the country-wise, economy-wise. So to address that, actually, there is an example, the UAE, they are running a pilot called National Level AI Initiative. They call the Falcon model. They build them based on open source models, and layer on that, they build their own large language models, national level. So do you see that's a possibility for the Southeast countries as a sovereignty AI, as a possible option?
It is possible once the energy is there.
Okay, so you're saying basically the limitation is on the energy.
Absolutely. And I do believe for a full actualization of AI, you got to be at least at 10,000 kilowatt hour per capita.
Right. Very quickly. So
yeah,
if we can follow up.
And I do believe that on a more optimistic note, I think what Li Wenfeng did with DeepSeek was inspirational. It's non-linear. Okay, we can argue about orders of magnitude in terms of cost. I'm not going to get there. But I think it is inspirational to people in the global South that it is not impossible to produce something that could be cheaper than the pre-existing model. Yeah.
Oh, Don Emerson, senior fellow, retired. I'm going to raise a slightly different topic to get off of technology, if I could briefly, and concentrate on the narrative. And I agree with you. The narrative is really important. It's important for subjective reasons. When we talk about technology, we're talking about the real world. But when we're talking about the narrative, we're talking about what people think and what they believe, whether or not they have a solid empirical base for having those particular opinions. Now, as you may know, the Southeast Asian studies is in turmoil, to put it mildly. It is under attack. In fact, area studies in this country, the United States, is under attack. Title VI, which for all of those years, right? How many something? One estimate is that about $2 billion over the years went into the support for scholarships of Americans who wanted to study in Southeast Asia, learn Southeast Asian languages, and so forth, and of course other countries as well. I'm not limiting it to Southeast Asia. Now, the President of the United States, in wiping out the Department of Education, is also wiping out Title VI. Title VI now ceases to exist. So automatically, you have cut off the possibility of Americans learning the narrative, or at least their narrative. It doesn't have to be a single narrative, right? One might respond to what I'm saying by saying, Don, you're living in the last century. Area studies were a product of colonial rule. Let's remember that, right? Well, thank God we got rid of colonial rule. Do we really need area studies at all? Here at Stanford, the focus in the Door School, which I completely support, is on energy, which is policy, policy, policy. Southeast Asian studies are not just about policy. They're about culture. They're about history. They're about language, right? And if I may introduce China without wanting to appear like, I'm kind of, excessively concerned with what China is doing, one might say that the opposite is true in the People's Republic of China, where, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative has developed a whole range of thousands of scholarships and so forth within the SCO community, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, not just within China. So area studies are alive and well, and they're living in China. And an interesting question will be, what are area studies with Chinese characteristics as opposed to American ones? Now, I've said more than enough, and I'm leaving it up to you to respond. To what extent is, this notion of area studies a kind of, a little bit of a luxury for pseudo-intellectuals that want to play around with it, but it doesn't really matter? Or to what extent does it really centrally involve the narrative that you're talking about?
Look, as of late, I've enjoyed talking to geologists because they think in terms of hundreds of millions of years. They educate me to think long term. If you ask me to pontificate about what could happen in the next year or two, I'm not the guy. But I take the long view. Whatever I'm seeing happening in the US right now could be just an episodic stress. But I think it takes two to tango, both the Americans and the Southeast Asians. And my job right now is to socialize the importance of the region to, first of all, the Southeast Asians. That they need to learn more about numeracy and literacy so that they tell the stories proportionally better, right, than have been. And hopefully by then, whatever symptoms we're witnessing today are going to be long gone, or at least dissipating, with the hope and view that there's going to be a policy recalibration. I'm with you. I think for Southeast Asia to be relevant, there needs to be at least 100 to 150,000 Southeast Asians studying all across campuses in the US. At least 50 to 100,000 Americans studying in Southeast Asia or about Southeast Asia. And by way of looking at the way things are articulated by policymakers in Washington today, it doesn't reflect upon depth and experience with respect to not just Southeast Asia, but many parts of the world. And I'm hopeful that that's episodic, but in the meantime, I want to socialize the importance of Southeast Asia and for Southeast Asians to better narrate their stories. Yeah.
We had a hand in the back a moment ago. Yeah.
Hi, Pak Gita. Thank you for your talk. I'm Vivian from Stanford MBA. You talk a lot about energy and AI just now. And actually, the Secretary of Interior, Doug Burgum, recently came here and talked on his energy freedom tour, and also talk about how America has positioned energy, has declared a state of emergency for energy. And so I guess the way that he framed it from my outsider perspective seems to be that we need to get as much energy as possible, given that it is US leverage by hook or by crook. And so I'm interested in knowing how do you think, America's position in approaching energy will affect Southeast Asia's position in renewable energy or any type of source of energy?
Well, episodically, we're seeing a departure from the earlier or pre-existing persistence to embrace renewable energy, right? It may have something to do with the kind of realism within the energy narrative, in that if the US were to try to attain supremacy in AI, it may inevitably have to rely on conventional wisdom to some extent. As we speak right now, the US has about 1,300 gigawatts worth of power generation capabilities. About 2,600 gigawatts are in a wait list, twice the amount. When they build that 2,600, they'll get to where China already has. China already has 2.5 times more energy than the US, but on a per capita basis, they're electrified at still the same at 10,000 kilowatt hour per capita. You take a look at the exportation of coal from Indonesia to China last year. Out of 800 million tons of coal we produce, we sent 250 million tons of coal to China. And every year that tonnage increased. it only tells me that China, as much as they're building a lot of nuclear, solar, hydro, wind capabilities, they'll still have to rely on conventional wisdom because they want to attain supremacy in AI. Because AI, as I referred to earlier, uses disproportionately much more energy than conventional wisdom. So if that race between the US and China were to be held incessantly, then I think there's going to be a dependence on conventional wisdom under any administration. That would be my pragmatic view. Will that benefit Southeast Asia? To some extent. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be decommissioning the pre-existing coal-fired capabilities. We should. We have to. But we've got to make sure that it's economically safe, for the transition. At the moment, it's not. The affordability is still at 5 cents per kilowatt, whereas all the renewables can only be procured at 15 cents per kilowatt. So it depends on the view taking on when the two will intersect. I'm a much bigger believer of that 15 cents coming down faster than the 5 cents going up, because the 5 cents going up will depend on whether or not you will have political neurosis. The developing world is characteristic of such neurosis, whereas the technological innovation, I think, will be able to lower the 15 cents at a much faster rate. I think in the next 10 years, we're going to see some game-changing stuff that will allow not only for the intersection to take place, but I think for the narrative to be upended. The narrative of sustainability will become such that it's the narrative of sustainability with profitability all across the world. That, I think, will resonate well to the global south. Yeah.
Yes, please, Tom.
Thank you, Gita. I want to ask about sequencing and why it hasn't happened. I agree with everything that you said, that the need is there, the potential there, the potential rewards in Southeast Asia are great. The money is there. The technology is there. Rule of law and human capital are not. That the human capital, that's a decades-long proposition to build it, and it should have started decades ago. Rule of law is probably attainable sooner. I think it is the most critical element of this. So the two questions, I have three questions about it. One is, all of these factors have been known, that you've put them together in a very effective way, but they're not new discoveries. So question one, why hasn't it happened previously in the region, except in Singapore? That without identifying the problem that has to be fixed, it's hard to go forward. The second is the insider-outsider, that whatever you identify as the reasons it hasn't happened, what has to, must this be done by people of the region, people of a particular country in the region? Is region the wrong unit here? This has to happen in Indonesia or Thailand, and wherever specifically. Or is there a role for outsiders, particularly governments, that can assist, accelerate, or is that a reversion to Don's, we got rid of colonialism and that's a good thing. Conditional aid and all that kind of thing, helpful or hurtful. And the third is the sequencing, that everything needs to be done, but everything can't be done at the same time. Where do we start?
In my book, I advocated for a relook into the pre-existing principle of subsidiarity of ASEAN. ASEAN, as you aptly know, is the organization that helps manage members of Southeast Asia, but it's not supranationalist like the EU. It doesn't impose upon member countries as it relates to immigration, monetary space, and all that stuff. It has been a fantastic consensus building platform. It's non-interfering, but in my book, I daringly advocate for a relook into the pre-existing principle of subsidiarity so that ASEAN can interfere, but only for one thing, not politics, not economics, not social calculus, no, nothing. Only with respect to education. I think the structural impediment that explains many things in Southeast Asia is the educational divergence. We've got a best practice of education in a country called Singapore at the non-tertiary and tertiary levels. How about just copycat it to all the other 9 countries? And I think ASEAN can play a role here by way of imposition with differentiated timelines. Perhaps the Cambodians will need 15 years, Indonesians will need 10 years, the Thais will need 9 or 11 years. And it will take, pragmatically speaking, I think 2 countries to push this forth. It will require the Singaporeans to agree for their system to be copycatted, and it will require somebody who can blow the trumpet the loudest, and that's Indonesia. Indonesia, population-wise, represents 43% of ASEAN, economically around 43% too. So if Lawrence Wong and Prabowo Subianto get together, they agree on some sort of a frame as for the educational best practice in Singapore to be copycatted all across the other 9 countries, I think we're going to be able to produce the second, which is human capital, earlier. I think the rule of law later. Now, investment thesis is not absolutist. It's that of directionality. A potential investor looks at a destination, sizes up as to whether tomorrow will be better than today. The day after will be better than tomorrow, or the week after will be better than the day after tomorrow. If he or she sizes up that directionally it's going to get better, he's going to put money. He doesn't have to believe that today's perfect, nor does the destination have to present itself as being perfect. But if the destination has the wherewithal to say to the potential investor, we're putting money into education, we're going to improve upon our anti-corruption agency practice or whatever, just watch whether tomorrow will be better, the day after will be better. They can size up, rectify, and verify to the extent that directionally it's moving in the kind of direction that's being presented, money will come. I've seen that. I've tasted that when I ran the investment coordinating board. They just wanted to believe that tomorrow is going to get better. So if they believe that human capital will get better tomorrow, then I think the money will come. More structurally, the rule of law, you just have to burn more sins, pray to God that somebody that's going to get elected is going to be of those necessary attributes of competence, integrity, and accountability like what we have in Singapore, right? But unfortunately, selection of talent has been systemically and structurally been on a basis of patronage and or loyalty as opposed to meritocracy in most countries of Southeast Asia. So I think rule of law will be sequentially after. There are signs of positivity with respect to human capital. Now, I am taking the long view. I set up my podcast recognizing the absence of a clear-cut leadership that can inculcate the necessary leadership for rule of law purposes. I'm trying to bottom up it with the podcast. And I take optimism from the fact that these millions of people that are watching are aged 15 to 30 in Southeast Asia, right? I would have thought that we were not going to get any more than 5,000 views because they were so addicted to TikTok. All those 30-second contents, 3-minute contents. But apparently there is this undercurrent of hunger and thirst for a proper discourse. So I'm actually more optimistic today than I was 5 years ago with respect to how we're going to be able to bottom up a culture that's going to yield better leadership that will provide the well-needed rule of law. But you're right. I think in terms of sequencing, I think rule of law will have to come after directionality as it relates to human capital.
I wonder if you're not afraid of China, if you're not afraid that Southeast Asia becomes the backyard, the colony of China, producing cheap raw materials, providing cheap labor. You're probably more familiar with FDI flows, trade flows than I am. But isn't there a possibility that you're just going to be a resource provider?
The BRI, when announced in 2013, was supposed to be about $800 billion for Southeast Asia. Thus far, the realization is only $80 billion. It's not because of lack of money, not because of lack of technology from China, but I think two parts. The first part is lack of accountability on some of the projects at the destination countries. And then the increasing concern in China as to whether or not they're going to be able to make money. I mean, I can tell you the high-speed rail project in Indonesia that cost about $9 billion. Without CAPEX, just OPEX consideration, it's only going to break even in 100 years, right? So I think the Chinese have the ability to think long-term, but they have to make sure the economics will also have to work. So the accountability on the destination will have to be shown more, and then the economics will have to drive the narrative a bit more going forward. I think earlier it would have been the geopolitical component of the narrative, but I think going forward it'll have to be increasingly economic. Now, the notion that offshoring or friendshoring is going to take place in a big way into Southeast Asia is somewhat misplaced. I think people don't recognize that China has shifted from a low-wage narrative to a full-fledged supply chain narrative, right? They've got better airports than most countries, better seaports, better rail connectivity, better highways, better supply chain capabilities, right? That's, I think, somewhat irreplaceable, difficult to emulate by any country as of today, including Southeast Asia. So Southeast Asia is not going to be able to emulate a lot of that. So the notion of offshoring, reshoring. So if we believe in that premise, intuitively, then there is going to be the flooding of goods and services from China to Southeast Asia, which has happened, right? This can be circumvented by rules of origin, regulations within the WTO, or by the recognition by the Chinese that they can't do this all the time because there's been blowbacks in Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia. And I think the elites in China have recognized this to the extent that they've decided two things: to build factories in Thailand. The BYD factory in Thailand was inaugurated just months ago. The BYD factory will be inaugurated in Subang in West Java in Indonesia within a couple of months, each employing 5,000 to 10,000. I think there will be more of these. So the first reason is the recognition for the blowback, culturally, socially. The second is the recent recognition by the entrepreneurs in China that they're actually going to be able to make more money manufacturing goods and services in Southeast Asia. Because if they were to manufacture in China, it's so much more competitive in China. It's less competitive in Southeast Asia. They have much more pricing independence or room, which will entail greater profitability. So I think there's more to come in terms of building manufacturing capabilities. But this has to be corroborated by much higher marginal productivity in Southeast Asia, which unfortunately we've not been able to produce. Indonesia's marginal productivity has stagnated at about $25,000 per capita per year on a PPP. Singapore has been the only exception. Their marginal productivity is above $200,000 of goods and services per capita per year. So we just have to figure out how to educate our people in Southeast Asia the way the Singaporeans have. Singapore is not perfect. I'm not the marketing director of Singapore here, but I think there are some best practices that could be emulated by other parts of Southeast Asia.
I think we have time for one more.
Oh, Mike. Oh, yeah. Okay, we'll take two. Please.
Well, okay, I'll be quick. Søren Juhl Jørgensen, thank you for sharing your insights and perspectives. I look very much forward to reading your book. Based on your comments about energy, and then also your comments about ASEAN's subsidiarity and education, I was curious about the role that ASEAN might play in the development of the European market, or the energy markets. Europe comes in here. Of course, you can say a lot about European energy policy, but the European community or union has played an important role, of course, in the interregional development of grids and markets and all that goes into that. So very curious to learn about your perspectives for the role that ASEAN can play in that.
But, by the way, a bit on the book, I decided to self-publish it because admittedly, I probably wouldn't be able to tolerate with the rigor of a typical university press. I probably would not qualify. And second, I wanted to sell it cheap. I want to make sure that it's affordable. We're selling it in Indonesia at $9 per copy. I want to make sure that as many people as possible would be able to buy it. And it's not on Amazon yet. It'll be on Amazon in 3 months. I want to be perceived as being local. We want to localize it first in bookstores in Indonesia, thereafter Singapore, Malaysia, all the rest, then on Amazon. But on your question about the ASEAN grid as it relates to what the Europeans have done, I've been involved in the conversation when I was in the government. I can say with some conviction that it's a bit of a pipe dream for ASEAN. I think it may be relevant to Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia on the back of massive hydro capabilities in the eastern parts of Malaysia, some degree of gas capabilities from Indonesia, but most of that is oversold already to the Japanese and the Koreans and the Chinese. And we've sold long-term for decades. So we can't extract much of that for, ASEAN purposes. And then in terms of the hydro capabilities coming out of Cambodia and Laos, I think Cambodia has certain sensitivities, as it relates to the Tonle Lake by way of the dislocation that's taken place. I think they will have to move forward very, very carefully. Laos, I think, has certain hydro limitations, certainly not enough for, streaming further south to Thailand and others. The way to do that is to figure out the economics. It's not the technology. The technology is there, whether it's hydro, geothermal, wind, solar, even nuclear. Conversationally, the Singaporeans are engaged in the SMRs for data centers, small modular reactors. So I think collectively, the Southeast Asians will have to figure out how to increase their respective FDI. That's the way to do it. I mean, in the context of the $200 to $230 billion worth of FDI, Singapore gets about $140 billion. I envision a future where ASEAN can easily get $500 billion worth of FDI per year. If we just show that we can translate from uncertainties to risk better, and if we can hopefully later on be better enforcer of rules and regulations, given the fact that there is $140 trillion worth of liquidity in the US, Western European countries, Japan, South Korea, and the Middle East, and it needs to be diversified to our place because of rising risk premiums in the US, Western European countries, and all the rest. But it's not being diversified out because we don't translate uncertainties to risk as well as we should, which is why I tell the MBA students there is going to be massive demand for MBAs because the MBAs are going to be one of the better translators, from risk to, from uncertainties to risk. I think that's the way out for, energizing Southeast Asia adequately.
So on that note of cautious optimism, Theo, I think
we have until 2:30, so
we do, yeah.
Question.
Oh, great. Okay.
So feel free to ask a question. Wonderful. Thank you for this wonderful book and a sneak preview of the book. I have two questions. One is on the narrative, and you touch on the relative peace and stability as a great narrative for Southeast Asia as a region. If you believe in Sam Huntington's thesis, there should have been many more violent clashes of civilization, and somehow Southeast Asia didn't have a lot of that. So why is that? And that's something that could sell to the right. Southeast Asia could sell to the world, especially regions like Africa or Middle East. They could learn a lot from Southeast Asia. So what would be the sort of pitch? What would be the exportable model from that? That's not question number one. Second, on education, I've been really puzzled by why educational achievement in the region haven't risen to the level of Singapore. And copy and pasting from Singapore, that's like a natural way of thinking about how to get it done. I mean, Singapore is a small country, so maybe only in Jakarta or more limited sort of geographic and populational scope would be more approachable. But I would imagine, and I want to ask you, what are the key main hurdles in achieving that? And I would imagine good teachers and paying them well. That would be a major challenge. And here, AI could actually be a game changer because a lot of teaching instruction can be done, especially in STEM fields and in entry level, can be done by AI. And again, there's an energy issue. But do you think that as a sort of game-changing device that could actually make the Singaporean model more implementable? And if not, what are other hurdles that are involved?
I still think as sophisticated a technological innovation can be, it needs the hand-holding or supervision by humanity. And that human needs to have STEM understanding. AI, I've talked about the structural limitation in the context of energy, but I think it needs to be shepherded by humans that have STEM capabilities in order for AI empowerment to be optimal. Now, if you walk from Sabang to Merauke, which is the longitudinal poles of Indonesia, 88% of the heads of household don't have university education. 93% of the electorates in Indonesia don't have university education. So I tell my fellows, friends, brothers, and sisters to stop complaining about the quality of politicians because they don't come from planet Mars. They come from that small pool, right? Now, it might sound speculative, but it might be in the interest of some people to maintain those percentages as highly as those. My interest is different. My interest is to lower 88% to zero as quickly as possible, 93% to zero as quickly as possible. So I think one sure bet is to bottom up it from a cultural, conversational, discussion, discourse standpoint so that it permeates into the culture that it's important to have a university education for anybody. Until such time, I think we're going to be exposed to political neurosis in many parts of not just Indonesia, but Southeast Asia. So I think education is paramount for getting the kind of resolution that we imagine altogether. But it takes long view taking. If, let's say, there's a leader in Southeast Asia that wakes up and says, we're going to make everybody STEM from now on, that would be a dream come true. But I think that dream will be out there for a long time, right? Now, in terms of peace and stability, I think one important facet about how cultural, religious, economic influences permeated into the cultures of Southeast Asia, very differently from other, areas of the world, would have been, in the early part of the first millennium, we embraced animism and shamanism. When Hinduism came from India, it came through socialization. Similarly, Buddhism through socialization. Similarly, Islam through socialization by way of the merchants from India and to some extent some from Arabian Peninsula. It was only Christianity that took place in a form of proselytization in Vietnam in the 13th century by the French. But that was a small part of Southeast Asia. For the most part, Southeast Asia went through hundreds of years, more than 1,000 years worth of socialization of cultural, economic, and religious influences that permeated into our social fabric, cultural fabric. And that, I think, has translated into tremendous understanding of each other despite diversity and divergence. Empirically, we've only killed each other to the extent of 9 million people in 2,000 years. Stark contrast to, forgive me, our European friends. The numbers would have been north of 180 million, just more than 100 million lives lost in a span of 30 to 40 years between First World War and Second World War. But this part of the story gets lost in translation about Southeast Asia. And it's amazing. I've walked into hundreds of ASEAN meetings. You've got a Singaporean who earns $91,000. You've got a Laotian who earns less than $2,000. They showed tremendous understanding of each other. The Singaporean knows not to be condescending upon the guy that earns less than $2,000. And the guy that earns less than $2,000 knows what questions to ask to the Singaporean. They don't rub off on each other the wrong way, ever, in my view, in my experience. I've attended hundreds of these. So I think that has certain historical explanation in terms of peace and stability. Now, I would underline that peace and stability are sine qua non for any kind of economic development. But the problem is economic development is not as robust as we want it to be because we don't have that cognitive capacity as much as we should. Now, I've gotten asked a lot as to why our president articulated the aspiration of growing the economy at 8% per year. I mean, I tell them very simplistically, our baseline is 5%. We're delivering 5%. The delta of 3% in a context of $1.5 trillion worth of GDP is only $45 billion. So it's only a matter of increasing our annual FDI from $30 billion to $75 billion. And $75 billion is still a lot less than what the Singaporeans are getting on an annual basis. So it's not an economic impossibility for us to be delivering 8%. But we got to get that rule of law. We got to get that translational wherewithal. So that's a long story around peace and stability.
Thank you, Gita, for the inspiring talk. I have been hearing your insights at various talks here at APARC, so it's really handy for us to have everything in the book to kind of, for us to refer to from time to time. So I have a question on counter narrative. My background is in IR, and in that discipline, the most important and unfortunately the question regarding East Asia is about hedging, and then most hedging. So, and the most dominant kind of perception or narrative is East Asia will only act as a follower and respond to this kind of great power rivalry. So I was wondering what kind of story is needed to counter that kind of narrative, especially, in one of your endorsement at the back of the book, it says to transform Indonesia from, a blueprint to lead, not to follow. Right? Because all the other things that you mentioned, like education and everything, still kind of implies Indonesia or Southeast Asia can be of use to this kind of, like great powers. So I was wondering what kind of story is needed to counter that narrative, especially in this kind of our discipline when China and the United States are all believed to be narcissistic and they believe all the behaviors from Southeast Asia are responses to their behaviors.
You mean as it relates to Northeast Asia?
Southeast Asia as itself, how to transform itself to become, to fight against that kind of narrative of being just a follower in great, kind of global order or great power rivalry, but to actually become a leader, an innovator in that sense.
I think once we can produce, roughly there's probably about 100 million people who speak English in Southeast Asia. All 6 million in Singapore. 10 million in Indonesia out of 285 million people. 70% out of the 33 million in Malaysia. 70% out of the 110 million in the Philippines. I would guess between 100 to 150 million people who speak English. Very few in Vietnam and Thailand, Laos and Cambodia and Myanmar. If we crank up that number to 350 to 400 million who speak English, that's going to help. If we can produce 2 million STEM products on a yearly basis, up from 750,000, that's also going to help. If we can reduce the educational and economic divergences in Southeast Asia, let's say all 10 countries in Southeast Asia would surpass the global average of PISA. And we have 5 universities in Southeast Asia out of the 8,000 universities placed in the top 20. I think we're likely to be an unfollower. Look, I say this with some optimism, not with respect to our ability to deliver all those in the long run, but also on the back of this increasing revisionism with respect to the pre-existing world order. Right? Ostensibly, the world order has shifted from a much more bipolar to a much more multipolar. And I would argue that Southeast Asia has been quite deft in embracing multipolarity in the last 2,000 years. We've been graced by civilizations from all over the world with very little bloodshed. That's an indication of our ability to embrace multipolarity. So if, let's say, the premise is that the world order is going to be much more multipolar, I think Southeast Asia would be quite deft in embracing multipolarity. But it will require 5 storytellers from each country to be able to come to Stanford and tell the story like this. I would long for the day when 5 Cambodians, 5 Myanmarese, 5 Laotians, 5 Thais, 5 Vietnamese, 5 Filipinos. So far, we've had disproportionately more Singaporeans tell the story about Southeast Asia. Nothing wrong with that because they deserved. But I think if we can deliver all those, I think the probability of our coming out of the cocoon of just becoming or being a follower has increased.
Thank you very much, David, and also thank you very much, Pak Gita, for having us here in this discussion about your book. I know Pak Gita for some time, way back in 2003 when I was posting in New York. Pak Gita was also promoting Indonesia.
Promoting Indonesia at a time with the Minister of Finance, Ibu Sri Mulyani. And would like to again thank you for your inspiration on this book and talk about ASEAN and how Southeast Asia can be leveraged in the long terms. My question is what is your suggestions when we talk about Indonesia and how Indonesia can play a little bit role in the context of moving Southeast Asia from when you mentioned about talking about periphery to global discourse consciousness, and what is your suggestion to that? Thank you.
Well, I think it's good to know that President Prabowo is internationalist. Right? I always tell people that our current president in Indonesia, he grew up in Europe, including the UK, Malaysia, and the US. He speaks German, French, Dutch, English, Bahasa, Manadonese, and Javanese. So his inkling is to try to do anything that would be acceptable to the international community, right? So that gives me some hope that he would be responsive to any comments coming from the international community, hopefully in a good way. I mean, you can clearly see that, he tried to make an impactful intervention at the UNGA, and he was yesterday in Cairo with a number of other leaders, including Donald Trump, to try to bring about peace in West Asia. And this is, I think, part of his, inkling, to be perceived as being internationalist. And I think we should take advantage of that, because I think we've somewhat not been as internationalist as we should have been or could have been the last few years. So how would that constructively translate to, how it relates to Stanford, right? I would advocate for a much greater representation of Indonesia at Stanford, or Indonesians at Stanford. I would advocate for him to get involved in ASEAN much more, so that the story about Southeast Asia gets heard, and at the end of the day, we can be perceived as being of optionalities as to look at China and the US neutrally, without being pigeonholed or being pushed to the corner. I think that's the role of Indonesia, because I think ASEAN, like it or not, needs an Indonesian leadership, naturally speaking, because of its scale, right? But it needs to be corroborated by spokesmanship, not at just the leadership level, but I think at many levels below that. And that's something that I think he's thinking about and working on. Now, what could happen better should be or could be the further degree of technocratization and meritocratization of decision-making. But I think that will take time, because I think he's somewhat still predisposed to the legacy, which I think he's trying to unshackle from. Yeah.
Hi, thank you, Gita. I want to echo what everyone said. I think this point about narratives really resonated, especially as a Southeast Asian, conducting Southeast Asian scholarship. Something I wanted to point out was that inequality is a theme that's really been embedded in what you've spoken about, and not just between Southeast Asia and other regions in the world, but also within Southeast Asia itself. And something that you pointed out is that these inequalities also exist within countries, right? And you've spoken extensively about these inequalities, especially in the realm of education. And as we know, a lot of what you've spoken about in terms of the human capital, the talent, the state capacity are concentrated in the capitals, in the highly urbanized areas. And so I wonder how you've thought about how do we mitigate rising inequality across cities, especially as we think about more rural areas or these secondary cities that you've mentioned, especially in this, effort to advance the role of Southeast Asian countries. So how do you minimize the inequalities that exist across cities as well?
I don't have the right answer, but I give a hint in my book in a chapter dedicated to the impact of technological innovations in terms of how they have actually elitized the pre-existing economic order. Right? I think the internet was the great democratizer of information, but it did not become commensurately a democratizer of ideas. It has polarized ideas. It has entailed concentration of economic capital. It's paradoxical that economic capital has become so abundant, but the abundance has not gotten democratized. And I fear that intelligence on the back of artificial intelligence, which is becoming abundant, may not become democratized the way we've seen with how the internet, that was supposed to be the great democratizer of ideas and economic capital, didn't do a good job in that. So as much as one would see intelligence from a cost standpoint becoming symptomatic to zero, that abundance is not going to translate necessarily to democratization. So if you've got economic capital and intelligence being concentrated, where is equality or where is inequality going to go, right? And then you add to that energy as the unequalizer, right? I mean, Java is much more energized than paradoxically Kalimantan, which has one of the largest subautonomous coal resource in the world, but it goes through brownouts. So I don't have a silver bullet answer to your question, but I think we have to relook at the roles of technological innovation, which unfortunately have not led to shared prosperity. But I'm just concerned that I think people are afraid to talk about it because a lot of people have become beneficiary of technological innovation. When I say a lot, it's the lot within that well-defined pool. It's not the lot within all the pools, right? So, and if you take a look at the technological platforms which have gotten away with not editorializing contents, gotten away with reduced spending on a relative and absolute basis with respect to content moderation, I think polarization of conversation will inevitably continue, and that will somehow correlate with the unequalizing of certain attributes, inclusive of monetary space. So I can speak for some space where I think the leadership would have to make sure that financial inclusion cannot be equated with access to capital. I'm a little concerned with that. Because if you take a look at Philippines, I think has a similar banking system as Indonesia. The branch manager of a remote town in the Philippines has a much lower authority level than the branch manager of Manila. So their clientele would have access to accounts, but their clientele would have disproportionately different levels of access to capital. The guy in Manila can borrow maybe 100 million, whereas the guy in Cebu or some other little towns can only borrow maybe 20 or 15. So just from a banking standpoint, you're already seeing how financial inclusion misrepresents the idea of access to capital. Yeah. And a Singaporean.
Thanks, Gita. I'm Holly. I'm a Singaporean democracy scholar and activist, and a master student at Frank Fukuyama's program. Thanks very much. My question is really around the middle income trap, right? I think we exist in a very strange sort of political economic transformation where many of the rungs of, the manufacturing base moving forward, moving up that ladder of from middle incomes to higher incomes seem to be missing. The whole rungs are gone. It seems to me that human capital as a way out of this middle income trap seems increasingly irrelevant. As a Singaporean myself, for all of Singapore's human capital achievements, it's increasingly becoming very difficult, right? I think Singapore has struggled very much to try to make sense of this political economic shifts. Despite having so many university grads, joblessness is rising. And the best product that Singapore has is really just money laundering, right? For all its prowess, right? And I think it just reviews the gaps that exist within Southeast Asia, I think, in trying to get in on the big game that every other big country is going at. And I think, Grumsky talks a lot about the old world is dying, the new world is yet to be born, and this current interregnum of political economy, transformations, chaos. Does your formula, how does your formula fit into this interregnum?
My formulation is relevant to those that earn less than Singapore. Most 9 countries out of 10 in Southeast Asia, forgive me for not talking about Timor-Leste, they will join by the end of this month. So allow me to speak for only the 10 countries, but disproportionately less than what the Singaporeans do. Bruneians, they earn like $30-something thousand. Malaysia, $12,500. So I think you're right. Singapore's got challenges. I'm not going to get into that, but I do believe that if we can remedy the 9 countries for purposes of piercing through the middle income trap by sheer investment in STEM, I think that's a big achievement already for Southeast Asia. And I'm a complete believer that I think a disproportionately larger investment in STEM for Southeast Asia, moving the needle from 750,000 to 2 million a year, will allow for many countries in Southeast Asia to pierce through the middle income trap. And I think when we get there, we're going to be able to embrace technological innovation the way we should. As of today, and I'll give you 2 examples that are quite, the Philippines has a BPO business, which employs about 1.5 million Filipinos, 9% of the GDP, all of which could be replaced by AI today. But the Philippines government is not doing that because of the large or high degree of political, cultural, economic sensitivity, because these are people that are not easily reskilled or upskilled. So technological innovation, I think, will have to go in an incremental manner in places like the Philippines. Indonesia has more than 40 million farmers, all of which could be replaced by robotics today. The government is not implementing that because it has tremendous social, cultural, economic, political sensitivities. So we're just going to have to do it with incrementalism. Will we ever be able to pierce through the middle income trap by way of embracing incrementalism? Absolutely, beyond a shadow of a doubt. But I think at the later time, we're going to be able to adopt technological innovation on the go the way maybe some developed economies are doing it. But at the moment, I think we'll have to do it with incrementalism while striving to pierce through the middle income trap. Over a beer, I'll talk to you about Singapore's challenges. Yeah.
So, Gita, I think that was an excellent way to end the final word. Thank you so much for not only sharing your ideas and vision with us today, but for all the work that you're doing to promote Southeast Asia through your book, your podcast, and by your presence here on the Stanford campus. So let's please thank our speaker.
Thank you.